Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today, I guarantee you, we have one of the most fascinating guests and interesting conversations. We have on Dr. Adrian Seeger. Now, Adrian, you have been a C-Suite executive for the last 20 years. You're currently a chief sales officer. A ton of your work has been in the sales environment. You've been in companies of a number of different sizes, but I think you characterize it as there had to be a fundamental change inside of the company to not only stay in business, but to prosper and to grow. And so we're always in a state of flux and change in most every business because we're trying to keep up with our customers, right? But this is at a kind of a different level. But how all of that in our viewpoint, how it impacts the customer and the prominence and the role that the customer and customer centricity plays inside of our organizations is what we're talking about. And that literally it's why C-suite misalignment, which is the number one challenge that all B2C or B2B executives that have come onto our podcast, over 250, has said that's our number one challenge. How it vanishes if we're customer centric, if we're customer led. And so what I'd love to do is, before we dig in, to give you just a moment, if you wouldn't mind, explain a little bit more about your background.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve, for inviting me to the podcast. I'm now, like you said, 20 years in sales and marketing, especially in distribution business, in, let's say, normally, and mainly in B2B business, in, let's say, the manual part and also the digital part, because it belongs together. And now it's coming together because you can't change it anymore in the future. That's what I did. Formerly, I learned everything as a consultant, let's say, the typical start after studying. And it's, for me, there's a red line in this whole career, which you just mentioned. That change is, for me, the relevant topic. So I always had, let's say, the task to go into a company where there is a change needed. And in all distribution companies, change must come from the customer, not from internal, because we have to consider what the customer wants, and then we can do the change internally. And so I had the chance to start my work when marketplaces came up, a very new sales channels. We all were talking about, well, it will disrupt everything. It did not, quite obviously today. So it's a new channel now. And then we started with e-com, which was then, let's say, the first thing. Then we talked about digitalization of processes, which is more or less not only an internal thing, it's also the interface to the customer, how we can come together more. For me, it's one of the main topics to focus when you want, let's say, to bind the customer more. You need more digitalization and step into his IT world. Then it's more difficult for him, let's say, to change the supplier. And today we talk about AI, which is more or less the logical next step. And so for me, it's very interesting. We still talk about sales, and we still have sales reps, and we still have to conversate with the customer. But the tool set behind, let's say, it changed. And for me, it's a quite interesting challenge to work in, let's say, in this dynamic field. And I think the change beside it, and especially here in Europe and here in Germany, where I live, we have a slightly struggling economy at the moment. So it's the best time to change. That's about me. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. You were telling me a story going through these restructures, and everybody's trying to figure out what's the most important reason why we're going through this restructure. What are we trying to get out of this restructure? And you had an interesting kind of epiphany that happened in most of these conversations and even recent restructuring conversations. And I'd love to have you start with that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, I think that when we talk about restructuring of a company, which comes, let's say, every couple of years, and it has to be done, that's a normal, let's say, a normal management tool. There is less focus on customers and we talk about restructuring, it's normally an internal topic where we do cost cutting, where we, let's say, reduce some more or less not necessary things. But what is missing to me, and I really believe in that, is the focus on the customer. Where is the customer in the restructuring process? And I believe if we start with the customer and the customer needs, we will do a more focused restructuring process and we will have the chance to restructure the right things and be stronger for the future. The other side is to do cash management. That could be interesting for investors this year, but not next year. Because view on the customer is a lasting thing, and view on the customer is more strategy, and it will pay on the profitability of the company in the future. I believe in that.
You got your PhD in business economics, so I think you've got a really good point of view on that. You also talked about in our past conversations about how customer centricity is not tool driven, but you called it an internal mindset. And I just wanted to learn a little bit more about what you meant by that.
When we talk about customer centricity, that sort of reflects in a lot of management teams that for that we need a CRM system, we need an NPS to measure it, and other tools. That has not anything to do with customer centricity. It's only a way how we can manage or structure the complexity, not more. Customer centricity is a question of mindset. I believe that if the whole company is aware about the topic, that there's only one source of money, and that's the customer. And with this money, they pay all the wages, they pay the rents, they buy materials, they pay their leasing fees, and so on. And if they know that, and if I say all of them, then I do not talk about the sales department. I talk about all the people in the company. They have to know that the customer is the main thing for what they are working for. And it's not abstract. It's very real. And I think it's a question for the management team, let's say, to give this mindset to the people. And for that, I think it's very relevant for the management team to show that the customer for them is the relevant thing. And then it's a question of mindset. And if you do that, I believe that growth will become sustainable. Because if everybody looks for the customer and his needs and understands it, you have to translate that, for example, for the HR department, for the controlling department, because they are not so proximate to the customer. But it's a question of how do we are aware about customers' needs and what will the customer do in the future. So it's also a question of communication.
Well, you brought up something interesting there, proximity to the customer. And in our last conversation, you talked about, in your company, ask the executives, the leadership, that if we're going to have a customer-centric mindset, because no company alive is going to say, we're not customer-focused, we're not customer-centric, we all are, but it's a matter of execution on it. And I believe exactly what you're saying is that it has to be a mindset, it has to be cultural, which means it has to be embraced by the leadership, right? Yet you just brought up this idea of proximity to the customers. In our first conversation, you said, in your business, ask your executives, when was the last time he or she actually met with a customer, right? How can you have customer proximity? How can you have customer-centric mindset if you don't prioritize actually having real conversations with real customers? And I just I know you have a world of opinions about this, so I just want to tee it up and put it over towards you.
Steve, you are totally right. And you asked the right question. And if everybody who's now listening asks themselves, when did I visit the customer last time? Not for dinner, not for party, but for a real business conversation about orders, about claiming, about the service, about satisfaction. Ask themselves, and if there is a management team who does not have the time for that because they have to do internal things and investors meetings and so on, I think something is running wrong, because they have to know what the real customer needs are. And it's also not the topic to only visit the biggest customers. They have to be visited by the management. That's okay, but they need to have a view about all customers. And all customers means small customers, mid-sized customers, big customers who grow, customers who do not grow. And if you have these conversations with the customer and you did, let's say, 3 to 6 meetings with those customers, you will have a very clear view about that on the top management. And then you can start the conversation. And then you can, let's say, you can feel what customers want. And I believe that it must be part of the daily work for top manager to visit customers. And it does not care if it's the CHRO or the CEO. They all have to visit a customer because they have to know what is on the market going on.
About a year ago, I had a woman on the podcast. She's a 3-time B2B CMO. She is also a value accelerator advisor for Goldman Sachs. And she helps recommend like where they had just recently invested $100 million in a start, right? And she said exactly what you said. She said, we should all, as C-suite executives, be spending at least 20% of our time talking to customers. There's no more important conversation to have. And you know what was her point of view is, it was interesting. It's like, what do you do in that conversation? And she said, here is my favorite question to ask. What is it that we do for you? And she left it open-ended.
It's a major question. Then you learn what the customer really sees, feels, what he's paying for. And the second question is, I always ask the question, what do you want us to do more or new for you to be the best partner tomorrow? And that's the second question you have to ask. And if you do, let's say, a couple of meetings with customers and then get all the answers together, then you will find what is the main pain point we have to solve tomorrow.
So I love this. If you don't mind, let's brainstorm a little bit these questions, because we're both recommending that we have constant ongoing conversations and we make it as big a priority as we can, right? So that means we're cutting things out to have these conversations. So the kinds of questions that we have in these conversations then becomes paramount, right? And so there was a CISO that was on the podcast, and he had just added to his tech stack, right? So he was the B2B buyer, and he put out an RFP, 14 different companies. They responded. He said every RFP said they checked every box that we asked them, right? Everybody did. It was a sea of sameness. And he said, here's all I wanted to know. What's the experience going to be like working with you after I hire you? He says, I know technically you can be proficient at what you do, and ChatGPT is writing code now, so feature benefits are going to catch up with each other, right? But I think one of the most important questions to ask in this conversation is, what's the experience like working with us?
Normally, why do companies do not know about that? The question is very easy. The answer is more easy. If the sales rep visits the customer, he has one focus. He wants to sell. So he would not start to conversate with him about claiming, about new models in the future. He wants just to do his business. And he's not in the position to ask those questions. He might want to, but he's normally not in the position. And that's the reason, totally, while as a management team, we have to visit the customer. And that's the reason. Otherwise, we would never get this information. And also think about NPS systems. That's a standardized questionnaire where in standardized questionnaires get standardized answers. But they won't give the right answer.
Nope. And these C-suite interviews, or just conversations, I don't even call it an interview, it's a conversation, right? And usually the customers, when they get on these calls, they're very appreciative to have the opportunity to voice their point of view, right? And it's a non-sales conversation. And what's so important about that is that every sales conversation has one thing in common. There is a shield up in the middle of the conversation. I'm being sold to. I'm being sold to by somebody that I don't trust. And that's not blaming any one individual, but that's like, look at the LinkedIn Edelman Trust Barometer, right? 61% of 32,000 respondents worldwide said that they think that we as business leaders are being intentionally misleading.
Totally agree on that. And I think if we start those conversations, let's say with the manager of the customer, and that he will have his purchasing manager with him, or his production manager, or product development manager, I don't know, but the relevant people. Then what you get, if you leave the customer, you get trust. And that's the main thing. And I believe if you start that, and if you do this regularly, the customer will trust you as, let's say, as people, and also as a company who will sell the best services and products. And also you will see that later on in the sales development, because it's easier for the sales rep then to step in, because the purchaser on the other side knows, well, your boss already talked to my boss, so everything is fine. So that's it. It's also a question of being pragmatic. And on the other hand, the deeper, let's say, advantage of doing this is that you get really insights which you will never get. And in normal times, it's the same in each company. What do you do if you want to know anything about the customer? You ask the sales reps. So you get information with a filter. And they filter it like they want it. They are clever. That's why they are sales reps. Yeah. But if you want to get it, it's not a question about what do they not tell you. It's a question how I see the customer, and how I feel the situation. And if I do, let's say, 10 of those meetings with customers, different size, different situations, and so on, then I have my own view about that.
And you know what's interesting? So I just had a conversation last week with the CEO, and he said, Steve, he said, if my sales team is going to close some big deals, he goes, they got to bring us in on those deals. They got to bring us into that conversation. Let us be a part of that conversation and help them. Don't protect us from it. Bring us in, right? And so not only from the perspective of what we've been talking about, this incredible learning opportunity, right? But these executive level conversations can happen with customers. They can happen with deals that are in the pipeline. And by the way, 86% of B2B deals stall at some point. So we need something more than just our sales reps reaching out again and reaching out again and reaching out again. Right? We need to be very creative in terms of how we do that. And by having most deals in the pipeline, would love to have a conversation with one of the executives in the company.
Yes. And it's also a question, if he wants to do a big deal with us, it's a question of acceptance. It's a question of let's say, meaningful work together with the customer, because it's not only changing of products and money. It's a question of how we can build trust for the future. And I think on the other side of the table, the executive of the customer, he also wants to have this conversation. He's never thinking about that because it's in his purchasing department. That's the same problem. I think if we start that, we will be more sustainable in growth.
And I love the words you chose there. You chose very wisely, because you said that he or she wants to have this conversation. Now, put that in juxtaposition of the B2B buyer journey today, where they're on this major self-serve journey and they don't want to talk to us until the very end, right? And if we have ways to create conversations that they want and we're not using them, these conversations, this voice of this customer, the centricity, it just, as you start to layer it in and you think about it, it's It should be so endemic to us, right? And how we're using it. And there was an area that you talked about that I wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time to talk about, because the number one issue, I think I said it at the beginning, with all organizations is internal alignment, right? Without the voice of the customer, guess what? We're all really intelligent people that have risen up to the C-suite, and we know how to make decisions. And we do. We make them all the time. But if every top department with every C-level executive is making decisions that are outside of being informed by the voice of the customer, then we are immediately moving apart, not together. And so how do you see the voice of the customer helping to bring alignment internally?
I think if we have to begin and tell stories. We have to have the customer story, and there is a project, there is, let's say, a sales deal, which is relevant, and then we have to transform this in the company. We need someone who translates it, that everybody's understanding it, who is not normally doing business with the customer or is very clear with the products or the services. But we need, let's say, the situation that the top management is starting to communicate about the customer. That's first. Not only internal newsletters with all the people who are in the company now for 20, 30, 40 years. That's relevant. But we also need stories about customer and the success with the customer. And also about the story who did the success with the customer. So we need the people on the stage. That's what we have to do. And if we start that, and if we do that regularly, every month, let's say in a communication, each company has this communication, then it's easier to get a mindset about thinking about the customer. And if the top management tells the people in each meeting that they have to think about the customer because it's the only source of money. I told that already, but it's the truth. And no one is looking for that. They talk about investments, they talk about IT systems, and so, but someone has to pay the party, and that's the customer. So we all have to be very clear that if the customer is satisfied, we will get his money, and we will also be his partner for the future. And that's, for me, the relevant topic. It's lasting if he's satisfied. And then everybody has to look for the customer. It's also if we talk about internal departments, then we have departments who are very far away from the customer. Think about the HR department. Their job is, let's say, to hire new people, to get rid of people, to do all the trainings and organize. That's a lot of job. But they have to know for what they are doing that. If they hire people, what do they have to look for as qualification or mindset of those people they hire in terms of looking for customers? That's what they have to learn. So there we have to start and tell them, well, our customers want people with those characters. And so go into the market and find people, for example, for the controlling department, but they have to have in mind customers count. So that's one of the things. And I think what we have to do is we have to that's an example for translation. I think we have to translate this customer needs directly to the business needs in those departments. And for HR, it's a question of hiring people and get only people on board with a customer mindset. It's not irrelevant in which department they work.
You had a message for sales, and you're a chief sales officer. You've been in a C-suite executive position for 20 years. You talked about elevating sales as a revenue engine, but you also, how did you say it? You said it that sometimes sales is treated like a cost center in terms of production and purchasing, but you related it all back to the customer. And I'd love to have you kind of tell that story.
In companies, we have this cost center structure. All companies have that. And in some companies, the sales department is also a cost center, and they view onto the sales department as a cost center. So then the CFO comes and then he makes his KPIs, and we only talk about how many sales reps, how many wage volume do we have, and what is, let's say, the right size of the sales department. That's the wrong view on it, because on the top of the pyramid, there is the sales department, because they are in the market. They know customers because that's their job, to be in the market. And above this pyramid, we have the customer. So we do not have a sales department as a cost center. For me, it's a value center. It's a center to, let's say, integrate the customer into the company. And this is why we also have to have a change. In the last couple of years, there was a lot of CFO business and CFO looking on the business. That's also a question of how investors see companies when they want to buy it, accelerate it, and sell it. That's for, let's say, a portion of time. It might be okay, but in the long run, it will not work. In the long run, it will never work, because you have to have customer-centric view in all departments. It will take longer, but it will also last longer. And then you have a company who is stable and profitable in the future for longer times. And I believe that this, let's say, really finance-focused view on sales as a cost center is not so profitable for a company. And it will also let companies, let's say, take decisions about sales which could not be right. Because then they, in times of depression or in times of declining turnover, they will, let's say, cut off sales reps. Maybe there are some people who are not so efficient. It will be, but it's not a question of sustainability in growing the company. So if you cut off a sales department, you will cut off the line to the customer. You will lose it. And there's no digital sales channel who could ever take over this.
It's B2B is a relationship-based business, right? And there's a lot of talk about digital sales channels and digital buying preferences and things like that. But right now, today, there is no replacement for the personal relationship that's developed, because we all know that trust is the number, like the emotional side of B2B selling is more important than the rational side. And it keeps the scales keep tipping, right?
You're right, Steve. And also for me, very important is that the digitalization of sales processes could not lead directly to a cut off of sales reps. That's a question some leaders ask. I had this on stage when we had a discussion with several other CSOs, and someone said, well, we've invested a lot of money in a shop solution, in let's say interfaces to marketplaces and so on, but we still have the same number of sales reps. Yes, that's true, because you can't, let's say, tell the customer, well, if you want something, buy it on the shop. That's not B2B business. It will not work.
So I have one more question that I have to ask. It's the most important question. All right. We have covered so much territory already in this conversation that for the C-suite executives, your peers that are listening in, if there was one thing that you wanted to make sure that they took away from this podcast, what would that one thing be?
If I only have the choice for one thing, for me, it's visit the customer and take his opinion very seriously. And then go back into the company and tell all departments, what is your expectation in the future, if you have that in mind. For that, you need transparency, that you go to the customer, that's okay. And you also need responsibility, that the people in the front line could take decisions, and not only the top management takes decisions. And also, you need the situation that customer success stories will be part of the daily business. So everybody knows how grateful we are in our company and how satisfied our customers are. So everybody should be proud going back home in the evening that we already had success stories with the customers. And then I would say fun comes back in the company because they are successful. It's like in private life. If they go to sports in their private life on the weekend, what do? They go to a sports event and then they see a challenge there, two teams competing each other. And the one is for that team, the other one is for that team, but they look for competition. And if someone wins, everybody is fine and they go home and everybody is, let's say, partying around. And this feeling and also the situation we should take back from sales into the company. And this is the story we have to tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have to say that this has been a conversation that I wanted to spend maybe another 2 hours on. So there might be a chance to bring you back onto the podcast because I know people are going to have questions. And actually, if they do, is it appropriate that we give out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out if they have questions?
Yes, please. Yes, they can do so.
The mission of this podcast is to bring different perspectives, different insights, different experiences and backgrounds, all in B2B companies with an ABM go-to-market focus, and share from C-suite to C-suite. And if we can do that, that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I just want to say, you were an amazing part of the rising tide today.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would just say to you, thank you, Adrian, for coming on. And I look forward to having you back on the podcast soon.
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Steve.